I'm Josie, I'm co-founder and CEO of Capture, and I'd love to welcome you to a series of monthly talks on sustainability, climate change, and the world we live in today. So each month it'll be either be myself or the wonderful Ashley Bishop, who is co-founder at Bagboard, who'll be speaking to a diverse range of subject matter experts, and we're very delighted to have you join the conversation today, so thanks very much for joining. I'll just give a brief intro to Bagboard and Capture first, and just so you know who we are and why we created this series of talks. So Bagboard is a conscious shopping platform which empowers you to promote, pick and purchase from brands who are kind to people and the planet, and you can find out more about them via bagboard.com. And then Capture is a sustainability engagement app and platform designed to help employees and also individuals as well track and reduce CO2 emissions from everyday life, and you can find out more about us via the capture.club. So today we're going to be exploring the must-know terms around corporate sustainability pledges. What we're going to be doing is starting with the basics. We'll then move on to talking about what net zero means, and then finally we'll be taking some looking at a practical closer look at sustainability policies of 3 example companies, and we will be doing that for H&M, BP and Apple, so 3 very different businesses. Now, to help us do that, we're delighted to be joined by our good friend and an advisor to Capture, Marc Allen. So Marc is director of Engeco. He's based in Singapore, and Engeco are a leading firm providing expert advisory on energy and climate change strategy. So put simply, Marc helps corporations of all shapes and sizes and industries to track and reduce CO2 emissions across their business. So he's a fantastic person to have with us here today. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Marc.
Well, that's all right. Thanks, Josie, and thanks for the invite, and thanks for a wonderful introduction. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, great stuff. So what I'd like to do really is just to dive in. We have audiences joining. I know some folks are from a sustainability background, others are not. So I just really wanted to start off with a couple of need to know basics around corporations and their sustainability pledges. So my first question really is, if you wouldn't mind, to walk us through how exactly you would define a sustainability pledge itself.
Yeah, well, what a question. And we'll start with the big issues. And look, businesses are increasingly making commitments and making pledges to the market in response to a whole number of different pressures, whether it be stakeholder pressures or social license issues, or, it's been a request from an investor or shareholders or something like that to do more about their sustainability commitments and come up with, really concrete things around that disclose to the market effectively what are they doing around environmental, social and governance, because a really big driver for that in recent years has actually been the investment community in many ways, and investors either specifically doing ESG related finance and investing or putting more capital into companies that are higher rated with regard to ESG, or having it as part of lending criteria or all these things. So, companies then are almost compelled to make commitments to the market, right? Now, where it sort of stumbles a little bit is that there's not actually a lot of consistency across what is expected. That's starting to change, and certainly expectations are being sort of normalized in some ways, and there's no real handbook. There's guidance on how to create, say, a sustainability report, and there's information that exists under the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and other organizations like that, but in many times as well, it's left a little loose for the companies to interpret and actually, say what they want or say what they think is material and do their own materiality assessment, etc. So it then makes it really difficult for someone who's not an expert in the field, or even some of these investors, to make these judgments on what's being set out in the market. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a big topic, and I think it's something that we wanted to explore because, as we say, from from an investor perspective, people are starting to ask questions of what companies are doing when it comes to sustainability, but also from the perspective of, who you're going to work for and who you're going to buy from when it comes to sort of purchasing, goods. And we know that consumers are wanting to buy from, companies that align more with their values. So of course it makes sense that companies would be starting to bring out more, I guess, serious pledges when it comes to sustainability. So with that being said, then I wondered if you could take us through what are, I guess, 3 of the most common types or categories, if you like, of sustainability pledges that you might have seen over the past few years, because there are obviously lots of different things that a company can commit to. I just wondered if you were starting to see patterns in terms of the types and categories of pledges that you've seen over the past few years.
Yeah, sure. So quite clearly and quite rightly, climate change is, a very important issue, and it's sort of bubbled to the surface as almost the issue that the world is going to have to grapple with, as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic and start to sort of rebuild economies and that sort of thing. So there is certainly a lot of now talk around emissions targets, emissions reduction targets, net zero pledges, carbon neutrality, et cetera, and then a whole array of different metrics and different inclusions and exclusions and all these things that come along with, ultimately, we need to achieve zero emissions at some point in the future, actually, sooner rather than later. So companies are getting on board with that in terms of sustainability pledges and specifically, climate change and greenhouse gas disclosure of impacts, right, and risks. Then you've got, companies that are making pledges around some of the more social things and things around like the Modern Slavery Act and, so minimizing slavery in supply chains and, making commitments that we don't have slavery in supply chains and workers' rights and, rights to unionize and all these things. So also a very important part. And so there are certainly many companies making commitments around sort of provenance, I think is probably the best way to describe that. And I suppose, the third really big trend, which actually cuts across both of those, is indeed supply chain and what companies are doing around disclosing some of the transparency around their supply chain and whether they can or even have an impact on, say, the carbon intensity of their supply chain or some of these other social issues which are equally as important, but or environmental issues that might exist up and down the supply chain as well, not necessarily climate change related, but also pollution and deforestation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's great to hear. And obviously it's really broad, right? Like when we talk about sustainability pledges, obviously that can mean so much, and it can each of these things you've mentioned can mean a lot to different types of businesses as well. So I could see, something like supply chain, perhaps when supply chains are extremely complex, being more relevant to a business that's producing goods as opposed to a company that's perhaps producing services, or somebody such as a Deloitte or an Accenture, when it comes to looking at each of these different categories. So
indeed.
Yeah.
And I suppose one thing that's really important in the world of sustainability is the concept of materiality. So, of all of the different types of metrics that exist in sustainability land, which ones are the most material, which ones are the most important? I use the word material a lot, but if you've not worked in assurance or accounting, then people might not necessarily know what material means, right? But it's a measure of importance, and you do end up doing a materiality assessment that says, well, these are the metrics that I think are important, that are important to my stakeholders, that are important across my supply chain, et cetera, and then targeting those, because also no one company can fix everything at the end of the day. Okay. Yeah, and the same goes with something like the Sustainable Development Goals, which are also something I haven't mentioned, but that they exist, and companies can't fix all 17 sustainable development goals, for example. So it's about, where can a company have an impact, and how do we make that known to the market, and how do we sort of disclose what a good job we're doing, or that this is something that's very important and we're not yet doing a good job, but we promise to do a good job later.
Yes.
Sort of.
Yes. Okay. So I guess on this concept of making promises and kind of going down that route, I wanted to dive into one of the particular categories of sustainability pledges that you mentioned around CO2 emissions. And I wanted to dive into exploring, I think, a term that a lot of us would have been hearing more and more, and that is the term net zero. I think a lot of us have seen many large companies of like all different types of industries have come out and said, right, we will be net zero by 2030 or by 2025, or we are already net zero. And what I wanted to ask really is, what does net zero mean? Is this the same as being carbon neutral as well?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question first. So to me, right, and like I said, there's no common definitions in this space just yet. But for me and my interpretation, carbon neutral and net zero are effectively the same thing. Right. And net zero is a nice sort of marketing term that's sprung up in recent months, and you quite rightly point out everyone is making net zero commitments, or at least being pressured to make a net zero commitment. Also, it's slightly easier to say than climate neutral, and fewer letters to type. So there's that. So what it means at the end of the day is your impact from the emissions that are generated from what you do and potentially across your value chain, right? And for some industries, it'll actually be really difficult to get to zero emissions, to get to absolute zero emissions, because we actually still need to generate emissions to create the things that we need and to manufacture stuff. And there's so far we can go with renewables, but in some and hydrogen and things like that. But at some point, there's likely to be some emissions somewhere in a value chain. So what we do is we then minimize our own emissions as much as we can, do what's called abatement, and then the net zero part comes because you then have to get offsets or do abatement somewhere else, right? Remove CO2 somewhere else to get that balance now between what you put out and what you then take out, so that becomes net zero. Now, one thing which I feel like is often neglected in the debate is, I guess, if we look at the goals of the Paris Agreement to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to 1.5 degrees by the year 2100, all of those decarbonisation pathways show net zero around the middle of the century, sort of sometime between 2050 and 2070, depending on which pathway you're on, but then net negative after that. So you're actually removing CO2 out of the atmosphere and taking CO2 away, because you can't actually achieve the temperature goals without an amount of CO2 removal. Right? Which then means you need to rapidly scale up things that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And net zero is part of that, because, like I said, we're still going to be generating emissions. We need stuff to take emissions out of the atmosphere. Currently, the best, cheapest technology to remove emissions is a tree. But ultimately, there's conceptual ideas of big machines sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is all a bit crazy, but it's potentially something that will be required, or some of these other things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So there's a few pathways, but they're limited and they're expensive and they don't exist at scale. This is our issue for net negative. But so currently net zero is about balancing out your emissions across your value chain with removals from the other side somewhere else.
Okay, all right. So now, so we've mentioned there are a couple of ways that companies could go about achieving net zero. One way, ultimately achieving it then means that any emissions, released by the company are then balanced out. So overall, there are no emissions related to that business activity. But is there any difference in one business trying to reduce emissions as much as possible? Let's say they reduce their emissions by 75% and then they buy offsets for the remaining 25%, versus a business that just says, actually our emissions are fine as they are, let's just offset it all. Because technically they'll both be net zero, is that right?
Yes. So technically that is correct. There is certainly pressure that'll come from stakeholders and other interested parties to also play the game and reduce your own emissions as much as possible and be a good corporate citizen at the end of the day. Now, the issue really with a strategy that just revolves around buying offsets is when everyone is buying offsets and there aren't that many offsets, supply and demand says the price goes up, right? And it'll get to the point where it will be significantly cheaper for you to actually reduce your emissions than it will be for you to buy offsets at the end of the day, because offsets exist in a market. So yeah, it is a bit of a flawed strategy to just try and offset your way out of it. Now my personal view is that there are certainly not enough offsets to go around currently. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be in this mess. The carbon cycle would actually just be doing its thing, right? If everyone just went to offset 100% of their emissions, we would run out of capacity to absorb offsets, right? And then that actually then becomes a much bigger issue because, like I said, there's certainly not enough offsets to go around. If you had to have a hierarchy of, who gets offsets, it should be, realistically, it should be the hard to decarbonize sectors that actually get access to offsets long term. So things like steel manufacture and cement and maybe even sort of international shipping where it's actually quite expensive and difficult to abate those emissions. Stuff like power generation or even a company that uses power, you should just be buying renewables. That's 100% what you should be doing. You shouldn't be using offsets for that.
Yeah, okay, interesting. All right. Well, I'm looking at the time and I know, as per usual with this series, we pack massive questions into half an hour slots every time. We'll probably end up running over by about 10 minutes or so because I want to allow some time for questions at the end. What we're going to do, all right, so we've talked a little bit about the categories of sustainability pledges. We've talked about net zero, and obviously people can kind of see that there are different ways to achieving net zero. Not all ways are created equal. Bearing in mind, having discussed those two pieces, what I wanted to do was basically dive into 3 companies and take an overview of sustainability policies that I can easily find online, right, for each of these companies. And we're looking at it from a consumer perspective, right, from the perspective of somebody buying goods and services from a firm. That's why we've chosen H&M, that's why we've chosen BP and Apple. So from the consumer perspective, I wanted to discuss your thoughts really, Marc, on the types of goals that have been given by these companies and also what consumers can keep a lookout for. So I wanted to start with H&M. Now, I've been doing a little bit of research on H&M this morning, and I've seen that they have, so basically they had, this is as far as I can see easily online, and again, from a consumer's perspective, I can see that they had a code of conduct which was launched in 1997. This was replaced in February 2016 with a sustainability commitment plan that is mandatory for any supplier or business partner before entering a business relationship with the H&M group. So within this sustainability commitment plan, there are a number of categories. They talk about healthy workplaces, healthy ecosystems, and animal welfare. Within healthy ecosystems, they talk a little bit about the impact of climate and air quality. They talk about waste and recycling, use of chemicals, conservation of species, and water resources. What I can see from each of these is that the fundamentals are that the enterprise must conduct all operations in full compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So from taking a quick look at that from a consumer, what I can see is they're simply requiring their suppliers to comply with the law, which to me as a consumer would have seemed pretty obvious anyhow for them to be doing that. But the other thing that I found with H&M that I wanted to specifically get your thoughts on is, I saw that they have a plan to halve their emissions by 2030, and I took a quick look through their sustainability report. I can see that in 2016, 2017, 2018, CO2 emissions decreased. In 2019, I can see that they increased by 8%. Now, as I said, all of these are all massive topics, but just from the perspective of having a quick overview, from the thought of a consumer trying to choose a responsible brand, do you have any brief thoughts or opinions on H&M and what they've kind of simply stated online in terms of their sustainability commitments?
Yeah, and look, I suppose the first thing is, as described, the sort of original code of conduct or sustainability commitments that sit under that are they're a little bit less specific, I think. But that's changing, and some of these commitments around sort of emissions reductions and sort of hard targets help in many ways, and that's a trend I see a lot more as well. Most companies have moved from quite vague, fluffy sort of sustainability commitments, we promise to be good, to now we promise to do X by year Y, right? So I think that's helpful. H&M in particular, there are certain things that I quite like about what they do, and they certainly have outwardly some good branding around this, and actually have the whole bring your old clothes back and we'll recycle the textiles. Now, what I don't know is what is the impact of that. How many people are actually doing it, how much stuff are they collecting, are they actually recycling it, or are they downcycling it, or what's actually going on. That's some of the transparency around sort of outcomes can sometimes be a bit lacking. I will confess I have not read their sustainability report, but I'm sure the answers are in there at some point. But yeah, the difficulty for me is always the follow-up. So it's one thing to set the target, but then how are we doing against that target? I think that's the thing where transparency actually needs to be a lot better for almost every company, I think.
For sure.
Single out H&M in this case.
Yes, and I mean, like, specifically, so when they've talked about their plans to halve emissions by 2030, obviously, and for our guests joining here, having a plan to halve emissions by 2030, that's a different kind of plan than a net zero plan. And I wondered if you could maybe just briefly kind of explain the difference, I guess, or perhaps it's super obvious.
Yeah.
Just to sort of
it's actually on the way there. So two things are important, right? One, the long-term vision. The long-term vision is important. It sets the direction for the company, and if that is net zero emissions by 2050, then that's a nice ambition to have. But equally, actually possibly more important, is the how are you going to get there? What is the roadmap? Right, and what are the interim targets that you set along the way? Now, a 50% emissions reduction by 2030 is actually largely recognised as the sort of emissions reduction that we need globally to achieve 1.5 degrees. So now, obviously, I know that because I've read the 1.5 degree special report from the IPCC. So, I'm comfortable that halving emissions by 2030 is actually aligned with what one would expect for the Paris Agreement, for example.
Interesting. Okay. Yes, because my question was going to be then, as a customer, is this enough? Is this okay? Because I think that's something also that we're kind of lacking, is how do we make sense of these kind of targets? So okay, so I'm gonna move on, because I know, again, we could spend a lot of time on all of these. I would love to hear your thoughts on BP and yes, because I know you're sort of more familiar with their brand in particular. Could you give us a super brief, if you can, overview on BP's climate change commitments, and sure, any thoughts on those would be great.
Yeah, so BP, that they were honestly probably a little way behind some of their peers, and what we have actually in the oil and gas industry is a pretty big disconnect between what the Euro majors are doing in terms of decarbonisation and what the US-based companies are doing as well. So that's a thing that exists. So there's some stuff coming out of the US now, but it is all, I suppose, a little bit late. And I think that's to do with the change in the administration more than anything else. However, BP were a little bit behind some other companies, but they've made some pretty firm commitments and a new corporate strategy just in 2020 that really put them industry-wise at the forefront of decarbonisation. Now, the reason I say this is a couple of things. So firstly, they have set a net zero goal, right, by 2050, net zero across the entire value chain of what they do. And their entire value chain is about 300 million tonnes of greenhouse gases. So it's significant.
Can I just ask a question there? So does that mean that if I had a petrol car and if I bought fuel from BP, I drove that car and there are emissions released from that fuel, does that mean, and BP said they're going to be net zero across their entire value chain, does that mean that the emissions from that car journey would be offset somehow, or?
Ultimately, yes. That doesn't occur now. It does occur if you're a BP fleet car driver. You can actually get offsets bundled with the fuel that you purchase from them. But ultimately, yes. But the future for BP is not actually in supplying petroleum to people at the end of the day, and they recognise this. And so this is why. So yes, they're going to set net zero emissions targets across their value chain, but they're doing that by, first of all, adjusting their portfolio, so they're selling less oil and gas. And in fact, they are the biggest company to make a commitment that they expect to be making 40% less oil and gas by 2030, which is just around the corner. And that's huge, because currently all of the revenue comes from oil and gas. And they're saying, we're going to pledge to produce 40% less oil and gas, right? Less than what we're producing today. And we're not going to do any exploration in any new countries. That's a pretty big deal for a company that actually makes all of its money from that thing. Saying we're not going to do this thing anymore. We're actually going to do these other things which involve renewable energy, which involve electric vehicle charging, which involve hydrogen and all these other sort of zero carbon options. So, it is small steps though. That's the thing. So BP's made some pretty bold commitments, and they are sort of adjusting where their capital goes. But clearly today, most of their capital goes into finding new oil and gas. In the future, that will change, and they're looking at upping that to $5 billion a year. So that's a tenfold increase from where we are today. Still small numbers in terms of their total capex spend, but significant, I think. So they've got a whole bunch of targets that sit around that, and actually a plan. And this is the thing that I like. It's, we're going to be net zero by 2050, but we're also going to be at this point by 2030, and we expect to be doing these things by 2035, and we're doing this by 2040, and actually a reasonable plan to get there.
Interesting. Okay, so would that be kind of one of your tips for things to look for from a consumer's perspective when we're looking at these brands and the goals that they're making, to really see is there a concrete plan behind this?
Yes, absolutely. Because a net zero target at 2050, whether it's a company or a country, right? 2050 is a long way away. That's 30 years. So that's 10 CEOs. That's 6 prime ministers. A lot can change in a 30-year period, and it's actually, for me, quite easy for a company to say, "Oh, we'll be net zero emissions by 2050." I can stand up as the CEO of a company and say that, because I know I'm not going to be the CEO in 2050. Yeah. So It doesn't matter if we don't achieve it, right? So what is important is the roadmap, the interim targets, and actually the plan. That is super important for how to get there.
Okay, very cool. All right. Well, the last one that I wanted to touch on very briefly then, so we've talked about H&M, we talked about BP. Let's talk about Apple. So Apple unveiled, I think it was in the summer of last year, a plan to become carbon neutral across its entire business, manufacturing, supply chain and product life cycle by 2030. So that's a year that we can all see coming. But they've said that the company is already carbon neutral today for its global corporate operations. And this new commitment means that by 2030, every Apple device sold will have a net zero climate impact. Now they've also said, because remember we talked about this earlier in terms of net zero, you doing that via offsets, or how exactly are you doing that? So they've said that they plan to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030, and then developing innovative carbon removal solutions. I don't know, obviously, what those would be interesting to see for the remaining.
They don't know what they are yet.
For the remaining 25% of its comprehensive footprint. So yeah, what do you make of all this? It would be
really. So this is great. This is, you know, confounding people with numbers as well. And cagey is not the right word, but you know, you have to sort of unpack what they've said and figure out, you know, what it means. So yes, they're carbon neutral, by their account, carbon neutral in their operations, right? Which is, you know, commendable. But that would be primarily offices, retail, and data centers, right? Because they're their operations. Manufacturing doesn't belong to Apple; that belongs to Foxconn, or it belongs to whoever makes the glass that sits on the front of an iPhone, whoever makes the aluminium in my MacBook. You know, so when they start to talk about zero emissions across their supply chain, that's when it starts to really get interesting, and sort of how much influence can they actually have. You know, they are Apple, so they can have quite a lot of influence over their supply chain, and that's a good thing about big companies. If they make these commitments, they can force the supply chain to do things. However, their sort of tendrils only stretch so far. You don't have really good visibility sort of a few levels out, and I suppose this is something as well potentially that H&M has to deal with, because you say, you know, we have, you know, sustainable suppliers in our supply chain, but the reality is when you get down to sort of deep down there into the virgin materials, you actually don't really know, right? You're just reliant on sending a survey to someone and maybe doing an inspection of a factory somewhere sometime, right? So yeah, look, I think my understanding is Apple have achieved many of these goals by purchasing renewable energy, which is awesome, right? And that is the way to do things, sort of, rather than offsets. I think if they did it all with trees, that would be a little bit frustrating to me. But you know, because their primary emissions are what's called scope 2 emissions, so they're indirect electricity related emissions. So renewable energy is the answer for that. So yeah, look, as far as sort of this 25% innovative CO2 removal solutions, I do not know what they are, and that is probably a thought that new tech will come, right? And that's the thing. And maybe if I, you know, just mention that for a second, because there is sometimes a tendency to go, well, new tech will save us, right? And that doesn't actually reflect the reality, which is a lot of technological solutions are out here already and can be deployed, just need sort of will and capital and scale to be deployed. The commercialization pathway for new tech is actually quite long. And if it, you know, if some clever person invented cold nuclear fusion tomorrow, it's going to be 20 years before it's everywhere, and by then it's too late, because you've got 20 years worth of emissions that you now need to remove, right? So yeah, waiting for new tech can sometimes be a little bit dangerous.
Okay, awesome. I was going to make some kind of joke about like waiting for a new iPhone, but yes, there's a lot there that Apple has to sort out.
What Apple do that's really nice is that they do have a really good take-back program for their stuff, you know, and they've got commitments to use zero virgin materials by some unspecified time, right? And I think that's really cool. Although you might be able to see I'm wearing AirPods right now. These are impossible to take apart and impossible to recycle, and they're very annoying from that point of view. But you know, they've got technology to take apart phones and get to the materials again and reuse them.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. So that was a really great overview then of three very different businesses. And yeah, thanks everyone for bearing with us. As you can tell, each of these topics are really massive. Like we could spend, I'm sure, hours talking about the sustainability policies of each of those three companies. So that was really great overview. Thanks so much, Marc. What I wanted to do now is I know some folks may need to head off, and that's fine, but we'll just stick around perhaps for sort of 5 minutes or so, just to take any questions that anybody might have. So obviously we've been through a lot today, as per usual, on these series of talks. So we've talked about sustainability pledges and what they mean. We talked about net zero. We've deep dived into 3 different companies and what they're doing. So I suppose, does anybody have any questions? If you do have any questions, please leave them in the chat box. So anything around when it comes to looking at corporate sustainability pledges, like what should we look for, any particular questions that anybody might have, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. And Marc and I will do our best to answer them. And if we don't have,
I do know there's certainly a lot of stuff to unpack, and this whole area is confusing in many ways. And
yes, there's a lot. These are massive topics. So we have one question that's been asked by Hamish. Hamish, thank you very much for your question. And this is what do you make of the use of wood as a fuel?
Oh wow. Yeah, good question. So look, bioenergy has a place in the future world. Now, I'll just couch that by saying cutting down sort of old existing forest is a terrible idea. Please don't do that. Right? We don't want to promote deforestation. We don't want to lose carbon sinks. It takes a long time to rebuild those back to the level that they're currently at. So that's out. But if we talk about bioenergy as a fuel source of the future, now where actually bioenergy becomes really, really important is in this area of negative emissions and a process called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, right? So when you grow biomass, right, and turn it into a fuel, so the biomass sucks up CO2 while it's growing, and then you turn it into a fuel, you use that fuel for something useful like energy creation, and then you capture that CO2 and you put it back underground, right, in a carbon capture and storage project, then that becomes negative overall. That's good. That's a big win, and that actually needs to be scaled up significantly to achieve that negative emissions goals, right? So yeah, look, the use of wood depends. Is the easy answer to that. Depends on what the wood is and where it's come from and how much carbon's in there. But and
right. Thank you for that overview. Yeah, that's awesome. All right, thank you, Marc. I'll move you on quite quickly through the questions because we've got some awesome extra ones coming as well. So there's a question from Michael. I think this is a really interesting one as well. 1 ton of carbon is 1 ton of carbon. Does it really matter what sort of project an offset comes from? Are there any types of projects to avoid? I have thoughts on this as well, and I'm really curious, Marc, to hear what you have to say on this one.
Yeah, sure. So I will just say I did a webinar last week here in Singapore that was actually called "When is a ton not a ton?" because 1 ton of carbon is not always 1 ton of carbon. It depends on how you measure it, and depends on what baseline you set, and it depends on estimation methods and all these things, because there's actually not a whole lot of standardization across the board in terms of emissions reporting, particularly when we get into the voluntary market. So is there a sort of project that I would avoid? There are some that are, maybe the best way to phrase this is, where there's money to be made, there are people in the industry trying to make money, right? And that means not all of the projects are as legitimate as you might think they are. So what I would be looking for in terms of projects to back, so to speak, are projects that have the right governance and have the right verification and exist within a good system, a good registry that does everything you would actually expect and meets all the right criteria around additionality and things like that. There's some very technical terms in there, sorry. But it's really all about having trust in the system and having verification. Verification is super important, and making sure that those emissions reductions are real and that they're permanent. So it does mean that you have to do research about a particular project, right? But there are certainly some projects I've seen that are a little dodgy at the end of the day.
And just a quick one for folks that might now be looking for carbon offsets. Gold standard, are they a good verification way to look for? Anybody else?
Yep, gold standard, Vera, American Carbon Registry, CDM credits are, I would not buy them right now because we're waiting for Article 6 to be sorted out of the Paris Agreement, but certainly on the voluntary market, going to some of these guys, so like Vera, like Gold Standard, like South Pole, that sort of organisation.
Right.
So, but you should be able to go onto their website and check out their governance and check out their verification procedures and their methodologies.
All right, okay, got it, thank you. Someone just asked, can we post these names in the chat? Yes, I will do that for you just a minute, but I'm going to start Mark off on another question in the meantime. So there's one here, I think these two, I'm going to put them two in one if that's okay. And sorry about that, guys. So one question was thoughts on corporate greenwashing. What should you look for as a consumer to really understand a company's sustainability objective? And then there's also a question, perhaps this is linked, perhaps not, around a potential over-reliance or laziness of companies making future pledges versus taking actual steps in the future.
The short answer is yes. Oh my gosh, yes. Right, that does happen. So yeah, greenwashing, and they are related because, you know, it's quite easy to make claims and it's quite easy to set a long-term target. It's quite difficult to do stuff today because it costs money and you've got other priorities, and you know, we'll all deal with these things manana. So yeah, it's that I do think is a thing that's happening currently. What we do have working with us, I suppose, is a lot of groups, stakeholders, activists, etc., who are looking quite critically at what companies are saying. The same goes for greenwashing as well, right? That there are a number of groups who are critically taking apart claims made by companies and even providing information. Is this real? Is this not real? Yeah, it's difficult to, I suppose, come up with tips for a consumer because, well, I suppose it's difficult for me to make tips for a consumer because I'm in the industry and I'm looking at these things, and you sort of just almost develop this sense of, well, this is complete rubbish or this is actually something realistic and a real commitment. But you know, the things you need to be looking for are firm targets around things. So we are going to achieve some number by some time, right? And actually having numbers around it, and then looking for transparency in how they're performing against those targets. You know, that I think is critical, and that in many cases is the bit that's missing.
Okay. All right, brilliant, fantastic. Well, thank you. That I will definitely end on that one because that's a gorgeous way to end this talk. So thank you so much, Marc. Like really appreciate you taking the time to run everybody through this. It's been fascinating. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. Thank you all for your questions. As a bit of self-promotion, then obviously you guys know that this talk is run by Capture and Bagboard. I mentioned a little bit about our businesses at the beginning. Marc, I also wanted to ask you to sort of share, I guess, your contact information. Because I know you work with companies, right, to help them all the time calculate their emissions. Who's a typical client for you? How can people get in touch if they want to ask you some specific questions about their businesses? It'd be great.
Sure. Yes, of course. So yes, my company name is Engeco, Engeco. I will definitely put my website in the thing right now, in the chat right now. It's engeco.com.au. There is a Brazilian construction company called Engeco, but I'm not them. So I'm the climate change advisory company. I help companies of all sizes, and from, you know, small companies and tech companies with their emissions inventories all the way through to, you know, massive LNG facilities and their emissions inventories up in the millions of tons, right? So effectively what I do is look at these emissions, look at emissions growth over time, and then analyse what are the risks that they may be exposed to, and then what can they do about it. That's what I do.
Exciting stuff.
And you can find me on LinkedIn with no problem at all, I'm sure.
Yay, wonderful. All right. Well, a huge thank you again, everybody. I've dropped Bagboard's details and Capture's details in the chat as well. Please come back and join us next month. We'll be running a talk of this nature pretty much every month. So looking forward to seeing you again next month. And yeah, thank you so much again, Marc. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Josie. It was great. And thanks everyone else.
Thank you. Thanks then. Bye, guys.
Bye.